Armenia, located in the South Caucasus regions, is a landlocked country with a rich history dating back to ancient times. Notably, they adopted Christianity as a state religion in 301 CE, making Armenia the first nation to do so. Throughout history, Armenians have endured foreign rule, including the Persian, Byzantine, and Ottoman Empires. The Republic of Armenia emerged in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, bringing a new chapter to Armenian history. Throughout the highs and lows of Armenian history, one event has inflicted a nasty wound that has festered for almost a century. That festering wound is the Armenian Genocide. The Armenians were a primarily Christian ethnic group who lived in eastern Anatolia for centuries. At the turn of the 20th century, approximately 2 million Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire, primarily in rural areas, although there were small communities in large urban areas such as Constantinople. The Armenians of the Ottoman Empire faced many obstacles as a middleman minority. In a nutshell, a middleman minority is an ethnic group that is overrepresented in occupations like bankers or merchants, relative to their small overall population. The most famous middleman minorities are the Jews in Europe and the United States. Although only a small percentage of Armenians worked in these lucrative jobs, all Armenians were subjected to discrimination that described them as parasites, thieves and leeches who were stealing. This caused outbreaks of violence and persecutions throughout the late 19th century. In 1894, in the town of Sasun, thousands of Armenians were slaughtered. These actions were widely condemned by the world, but the damnations didn't deter the Ottomans. It made them more angry. In 1895, massacres of Armenians broke out in Constantinople, and then engulfed the rest of the Armenian-populated regions. One of the worst atrocities took place in Urfa, where Ottoman troops burned an Armenian cathedral, in which 3,000 Armenians had taken refuge. They would shoot anyone who tried to escape. Known as the Hamidian massacres, 300,000 were killed at the hands of their Muslim neighbours and the government soldiers. Many Armenian villages were forcibly converted to Islam. Violence would continue right up into the 1900s. In early 1909, the worst massacre happened. In Adana, armed Muslims attacked the Armenian quarter, and the Armenians returned fire. Ottoman soldiers did not protect the Armenians, and instead armed the rioters. Between 20,000 and 25,000 people, mostly Armenians, were killed in Adana and nearby towns. Two changes and events exacerbated the situation and turned it from massacres occurring in pockets around the country to a full-blown extermination. The first was the rise of the CUP, or the Committee of the Union and Progress. The CUP, or more famously known as the Young Turks, were radicals who wanted to bring about the end of the absolute monarchy in the empire. In 1913, they managed to take power under the leadership of Talat Pasha, who effectively became a dictator. Talat Pasha began to steer the empire to be more pro-Muslim, turning a blind eye to the brutalization of the Christians, including the Armenians. Secondly, during the First World War, the Ottoman Empire joined forces with Germany and Austria-Hungary against the British, French and Russians. Add to the fact that the Orthodox Russians had a very strong kinship with the Armenians. The Ottoman leaders openly blamed their defeats on the Armenians in the region and stated that they had betrayed their empire by fighting for and helping enemy forces. As losses amplified, the nationalist desire for the Ottoman leaders to create an ethnically homogeneous community began to grow. The notion that the Armenians were fighting against the Turks was a deliberate falsehood, but these governmental lies acted as a catalyst and justification for the genocide of the Armenian people. In January 1915, Enver Pasha attempted to push back the Russians at the Battle of South Caucasus, only to suffer the worst Ottoman defeat of the war. Although poor generalship and hard conditions were the main reason for the loss, the young Turk government sought to shift the blame onto Armenian treachery. Armenian soldiers and other non-Muslims in the army were demobilized and transferred into labour battalions. The disarmed Armenian soldiers were then systematically murdered by Ottoman troops, the first victims of what would become the genocide. About the same time, irregular forces began to carry out mass killings in Armenian villages near the Russian border. Armenian resistance, when it occurred, provided the authorities with a pretext for employing harsher methods. In April 1915, Armenians in Van barricaded themselves into the city's Armenian neighbourhoods and fought back against the Ottoman troops. As many as 55,000 people were killed. The leader of the province drew up plans to exterminate every single fighting-aged Armenian male in Van. The rebels in Van held the Ottoman army off until the Russian army forced the Ottomans into retreat. As the Turks retreated, they attacked Armenian and Assyrian Syriac villages. The men were killed immediately. Many women and children were kidnapped by local Kurds, and the others marched away to be killed later. The events at Van would terrify Talat Pasha, who was convinced an Armenian uprising was imminent. On April the 24th, 1915, citing Van and several other episodes of Armenian resistance, Talat Pasha ordered the arrest of approximately 250 Armenian intellectuals and politicians in Istanbul, including several deputies to the Ottoman Parliament. Most of the men who were arrested were killed in the months that followed. Orders were sent all over the country to do the very same. The 24th of April, 1915, is the date widely regarded as the start of the Armenian Genocide. In May 1915, the deportation of the Armenians from the empire's eastern province began. A series of consecutive laws passed by the Turkish government gave it the right to confiscate or otherwise impound Armenian properties and businesses left behind by the departing deportees as a wartime necessity, leaving the Armenian population defenceless, propertyless, and generally destitute. Forced marches and massacres became more commonplace and widespread, especially on deportation routes. The Turkish military instituted a number of gruesome methods to exterminate the Armenian population. Those who were not killed outright by the military often faced starvation along the way. At least 150,000 Armenians passed through the Erzincan from June 1915, where a series of transit camps were set up to control the flow of victims to the killing site at the nearby Kamar Gorge. Thousands of Armenians were killed near Lake Khazar, pushed by paramilitaries off the cliffs. More than 500,000 Armenians passed through the plains south of Malatya, one of the deadliest areas during the genocide. Arriving convoys, having passed through the plains to approach the Kahata Highlands. Many others were held in tributary valleys of the Tigris, Euphrates, or the Murat, and systematically executed by special organizations. Armenian men were often drowned by being tied together back to back before being thrown into the water, a method that was not used on women. Authorities viewed disposal of bodies through the river as a cheap and efficient method, but it caused widespread pollution downstream. So many bodies floated down the Tigris and Euphrates that they sometimes blocked the river and needed to be cleared with explosives. Tens of thousands of Armenians also died along the roads, and their bodies were buried hastily, or more often, simply left beside the roads. The Armenians who managed to survive the marches were sent on foot to concentration camps created by the Ottoman military. These camps were located near modern Turkey's southern border, in the Syrian desert of Deir ez-Zor. The Turkish government routinely withheld food and water from the Armenians in the camps. The lack of nourishment, coupled with unsanitary conditions and widespread disease, meant that life expectancy at the camp was extraordinarily short. Some Armenian women and girls were often sold while in the camps by Turkish gendarmes to local Arab Bedouins and chieftains. Many of the Armenian women were also routinely abducted and taken as forced brides by Turkish and Kurdish militiamen. Intentional, state-sponsored killing of Armenians mostly ceased by the end of January 1917, although sporadic massacres and starvation continued. Both contemporaries and late historians have estimated that around 1 million Armenians died during the genocide, with figures ranging from 600,000 to 1.5 million deaths. Between 800,000 and 1.2 million Armenians were deported, and contemporaries estimate that by late 1916 only 200,000 were still alive. Ultimately, massacres would flare up again during the Turkish War of Independence, seeing nearly 100,000 Armenians massacred in Transoxiana by the Turkish army, and another 100,000 fled from Silesia during the French withdrawal. To this day, the Turkish government denies the Armenian Genocide. The Turkish government maintains that the mass deportations of Armenians was a legitimate action to combat the existential threat to the empire, but that there was no intention to exterminate the Armenian people. The government's position is supported by the majority of Turkish citizens. Many Kurds, who themselves have suffered political repression in Turkey, have recognised and condemned the genocide. The Turkish state perceives open discussions of the genocide as a threat to national security because of its connection with the foundation of the Republic, and for decades have strictly censored it.